Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I am absolutely delighted to welcome you all to Parliament Buildings this afternoon for the launch of the Human Rights Commission's 2017 Annual Statement. It is also especially a privilege for me to be able to welcome our special guest today, the Right Honourable Harriet Harman MP, to Parliament Buildings. And whilst Harriet is known for the senior position she has held at the heights of the British politics in recent years, as Speaker, I want to recognise her reputation as a parliamentarian. She is one of those MPs known for using her position and Parliament to advance the positions and the issues she is passionate about, particularly around human rights, equality, women's issues, whether that was as a backbencher, as a minister, or now as a chair of a committee. For that continuing campaigning spirit and experience, she is one of the most respected MPs in the House of Commons, including by my parliamentary colleague Speaker Bercow, and it is a privilege that she can indeed join with us today. It is now something of a standing commitment in the Speaker's diary in the run-up to Christmas to actually sponsor this event. The connection between the Speaker's office and the Human Rights Commission is indeed set out in the Northern Ireland Act as part of our legislative process. But I am pleased that my predecessors and I have been able to go beyond that, providing constructive support where it has been appropriate. Of course, in hosting this event this year, you will all be aware that we are in difficult times, politically speaking. We all hope that we will reach a position as soon as possible to allow the Assembly to resume full business. I have made it clear to all of the parties that I am keen to exercise my responsibilities to call the next sitting of the Assembly as soon as an agreement can be reached. Until we reach that point, the formal legislative process of this Assembly might have paused, but the debate and the ideas over what members and the public want this Assembly to achieve in the future have not. The purpose of the Assembly remains to represent and reflect the concerns of the people it represents. At whatever stage the Assembly returns, as I think it eventually will, it will be even more important to connect with the community the Assembly represents and to listen to all the views and opinions available to us. I therefore welcome the fact that the Human Rights Commission is holding this event here today, as it has a key role in contributing to an informed debate. Now, you will know that there is little anyone says that would attract the agreement of everyone in this building. But as Speaker, my view is very clear that the more voices and perspectives that are included in the debate, the better the outcome is likely to be. The relationship between the Assembly and the Human Rights Commission has the potential to benefit both the role of individual MLAs in assisting their constituents and for the Commission in focusing its efforts on those matters where the government of the day can improve the lives of its citizens. This annual statement of the Human Rights Commission therefore provides the Assembly with additional insight and analysis on the experiences people face. I am sure there is no shortage of things for you to be discussing today, and I wish you all the very best with today's event. So without further ado, I now call on David Russell, as Chief Executive of the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission, to say a few words. David.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're delighted to be here today, and thank you, friends and colleagues, for coming out in the cold weather up the hill, and we hope we have a great event. I just have a few housekeeping things before I'm going to hand over to our Chief Commissioner, Les Allenby. First thing is the Wi-Fi network. The network is NIA Open, and if you want to then put in the password, it is NI Assembly, capitals NI and lowercase for assembly. We would also encourage you to tweet, as above here, so hashtag NI Statement 2017. And finally, in the event of the fire alarms going off, there is no plan for a drill today, so it will actually be an evacuation. So please leave the building in the event of the alarms going off, and as directed by staff to the front doors. That's me. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to the Chief Commissioner, Les Allenby.
David, thank you. I'm absolutely delighted to be able to welcome you all to the launch of the Commission's annual statement on human rights for 2017. And I'd also like to extend a warm welcome to Harriet Harman, first in her role as the chair of the Joint Committee on Human Rights in Parliament at Westminster. Secondly, as someone who is a parliamentary champion of gender issues and many other reforms, both within the Labour Party itself, but in wider parliamentary procedures in London. But thirdly, and perhaps slightly less well known, for her work as a human rights defender when she worked in the 1970s for the National Council for Civil Liberties, which was a time when the climate for human rights was, to put it mildly, not very propitious. And she has a few stripes on her back for those times. So with those three dimensions to her work, I'm absolutely delighted that she was able to make it here today. And I'm sure you'll be enthused when you hear what she has to say. Now, I am a glass half full person, anybody who knows me. But I have to say it's pretty difficult to find a positive take on human rights developments in Northern Ireland in 2017. It's a year in which there isn't a single green light denoting any outstanding human rights issues have been effectively addressed either by the Westminster Government or by the Northern Ireland Assembly or by relevant public authorities. And that reflects, as everyone in this room knows, the current state of play with the absence of a devolved assembly since the end of the first week in January, and the reluctance of central government or the Northern Ireland Civil Service to do anything other than retain where we are in a holding pattern. Now, the political stalemate between the two main parties does not serve human rights, and it's not in the wider interests of people in Northern Ireland. Now, I remember some years ago I listened to a speech from an industrialist, and it contained a slightly disparaging remark, which was that we used to launch ships, but now all we do is launch strategies. Well, I'm tempted to update that and say now we cannot even launch strategies. Strategies to promote gender equality, to improve the circumstances of people with disabilities, to enhance the lives of LGBTI individuals, and to tackle poverty based on objective need, all remain on the drawing board. In the case of the anti-poverty strategy, this unsatisfactory position prevails despite a High Court ruling 2.5 years ago that the Northern Ireland Executive had failed to meet its legal obligations to produce such a strategy in the first place. And implementing those strategies are, in my view, important when you take the new programme for government and its welcome outcome-based approach to policy and legislative development. And I'll give you just one example. Our annual statement highlights research from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. I always think, and I have done, the Commission has done some work with the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and it's a kind of wonderful body because its work is so good that governments of whatever political hue feel very reluctant to criticise it because of the quality of what they produce. And what the IFS have projected is a significant increase in absolute child poverty across the UK, and particularly in Northern Ireland, driven almost entirely by a rise in poverty amongst families with 3 or more children, which is a result of planned tax and social security reforms. And the impact of confining entitlement, for example, to new claimants for child tax credit and universal credit to 2 children only is exactly the kind of issue that MLAs in this building should be debating, particularly so given that Northern Ireland has larger families than anywhere else in the UK. And yet instead we've been confined to last week a discussion in the House of Lords based on a very welcome private motion from the Labour peer Tommy McAvoy on the implications of some of the exemptions to the new arrangements, particularly the rate clause and issues around kinship. But we should be debating these things locally. We shouldn't be relying on the goodwill of Westminster politicians on its own to deal with these issues. And again, it becomes important because in the next financial year, we're due to review the mitigations on social security that were agreed some years ago. And in the financial year after that, those mitigations will end. And the absence of an assembly means, in effect, we are risking that significant adverse cumulative impact of social security changes may go unremedied and unconsidered going forward. A further year has also slipped by without concrete progress on the outstanding legacy inquests and inquiries and other issues of our past. We can only move forward confidently into the future if we deal properly with the past and resource the necessary initiatives accordingly. And I say that recognising the political reality that any process will leave many people dissatisfied, and inevitably many questions are likely to remain unanswered. But nonetheless, one of the lessons of history of this part of the world is that the impact of the conflict is intergenerational, and the past cannot simply be swept under the carpet. And one piece of work undertaken by the Commission this summer was to provide a human rights analysis of the House of Commons Defence Select Committee report on investigations into fatalities in Northern Ireland involving British military personnel. Now, that report canvassed a number of options, including amnesties, a statute of limitations, ceasing investigations, or implementing the proposals contained within the Stormont House Agreement. And the Select Committee ultimately recommended introducing a statute of limitations. Now, the Commission, in its role to give advice to the Secretary of State, produced a response. And the Commission recognised that human rights law, particularly Article 2, the right to life of the European Convention, does require by law an independent, a timely and an effective investigation capable of leading to the identification of perpetrators, alongside consultation with the immediate next of kin to the extent necessary, whilst also recognising the human rights issues are at play for those under investigation. So a statute of limitations, for example, particularly where it effectively amounts to an amnesty by another name, is not compatible with human rights law. Neither is an amnesty, nor is ceasing investigations. So the Commission instead recommended that a review of the Sentences Northern Ireland Act 1998, the legislation that allowed those who were in prison to be released as part of the Good Friday Agreement, that there should be a review undertaken, including considering applying the legislation to offences committed before 1973. And in effect, what the Commission is saying is there must be, as I say, an investigation and an outcome for human rights purposes, but once completed, then how perpetrators are treated in terms of sentencing becomes a matter for legislative arrangements, and there is flexibility, and depending on what may be done around that, may be human rights compliant, and you'd have to see what those arrangements are. So for the Commission, the Stormont House Agreement remains the main game in town, and we are very keen to see the Stormont House Agreement and its institutions move forward as quickly as possible. I've given quite a significant number of speeches this year. Some of the people in the audience, I think, are probably fed up of listening to me, but particularly on the issue of human rights and equality implications of the exit from the European Union, and particularly around, as well, citizens' rights. Today, I'm going to confine my comments to just one issue. The Belfast Agreement, as you know, was underpinned by human rights and equality, and it envisaged an equivalence of rights across the island of Ireland. Not the same rights, but an equivalence of rights. And that was reflected in both the Irish and the UK government's commitment to incorporate the European Convention on Human Rights into domestic law. A Bill of Rights was also envisaged, supplementing convention rights to reflect the particular circumstances of Northern Ireland, drawing on international human rights standards. 20 years on, or almost 20 years on, a Bill of Rights remains a missing piece in the Belfast Agreement jigsaw. The nearest thing we have, frankly, to a Convention Plus approach to rights is the EU Fundamental Charter of Rights. Now, the UK government's position is to remove the Charter as part of the EU exit, though it's interesting that Dominic Grieve's recent amendment to retain the Charter was withdrawn on the promise of the UK government publishing its analysis of how these rights are already available through either the Human Rights Act on the one hand, through domestic legislation, or through the common law. Now, you might wonder, if we have all these rights anyway, why we need to get rid of the Charter. Nonetheless, the government has produced last week a 73-page document, and that attempts to, by way of a sleight of hand or a conjuring disappearing trick, to wave away rights. It might work for Tommy Cooper. I'm afraid I don't think it's going to work for anybody who has a significant interest in human rights. So, when you look at the EU withdrawal bill and you look at the UK government's analysis, the analysis is that the Charter creates principles and not rights. The rights are only applied when acting within the scope of EU law, and that there are no obligations in the Charter. And then you look at the same time at the EU withdrawal bill and its attempt to limit the retention and enforceability of EU rights in domestic law, and it runs counter to the government's analysis. Now, I haven't time to articulate all the counter-arguments, but I'll make one observation, and that is that if you look at the then Lord Chancellor's evidence to the House of Lords and EU Committee report on the UK, the EU, and the British Bill of Rights, which was published in May 2016, you'll see that the Lord Chancellor at that time recognised that the EU Charter gives you considerably greater rights than hitherto exist in domestic law. And that Lord Chancellor was one Michael Gove. So it's interesting to look at where the UK government is now and where it was then. And I hope it's one of the issues that Harriet's committee may look at with forensic detail. I'm pretty sure that Dominic Grieve will be looking at it very carefully. And therefore there is all to play for in terms of the issue of rights, and the importance again of a Bill of Rights in Northern Ireland remains, for me, an important issue. And I'll make one final observation about a Bill of Rights. It's something I've said before, but Bill of Rights are important when times are difficult and bad, when there is economic and political instability, and it's pretty clear that whatever happens over the next 2 or 3 years, we are going to enter a period of economic and political turbulence. And it's pretty tough to start trying to draft Bill of Rights when things are going badly. It's much better to try and draft them when things are relatively stable. So leaving it to another day is not a wise way to go. This year also saw the Court of Appeal overturn the Commission's historic High Court judgment that Northern Ireland laws on access to termination in very specific circumstances were contrary to Article 8 and a woman's right to personal autonomy. The case was heard following an expedited hearing at the Supreme Court in October. Now, I don't know what the outcome will be, either on the substantive issue or the question of the Commission's right to take a case in its own name. I spent 3 days sitting in the Supreme Court, desperately trying to look at the body language, the facial expressions of 7 judges, and I can tell you all 7 of them could play poker for England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Nonetheless, I have been personally reflecting on the case, and I would say this, whatever the outcome, I hold to the view that it was the type of issue that the Commission should tackle based on human rights standards. And it seems to me that the rights of a woman to access a termination in the 21st century in Northern Ireland, where she must be a physical or mental wreck at the risk of losing her life or face long-term or permanent risk to her mental or physical health, those circumstances pay no regard to a woman's right to independence. And it seems to me contrary to a modern society based on equality that we should be striving to achieve here in Northern Ireland. I also don't entirely believe in coincidence. It's probably to do with my long and jaundiced involvement in lobbying and public life in the voluntary sector. So when the announcement that the Government Equalities Office would fund terminations for women travelling from Northern Ireland occurred on the day the Court of Appeal judgment was due, and when the publishing of that guidance on financial hardship criteria occurred the day before the Supreme Court case opened, it suggests that someone in Whitehall has been watching the case very carefully. This year, the UK government has also undergone its periodic review under the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and the CRPD committee has issued its concluding observations, which made grim reading, frankly, for the Westminster government. Now, you could get cynical and say, well, the government will simply shrug its shoulders and carry on regardless. I actually think that the excellent work around UN treaty monitoring done by the Commission, its sister commissions, the Equality Commission, the Children's Commission in terms of UNCRC, and human rights NGOs, many of whom are in this room, is really important. Shining a light on what has gone well, but alongside where the Westminster government and devolved administrations are found wanting, is vital. The UK government wants to play a role on the international stage on human rights issues. It doesn't like to see that spotlight placed on its own backyard. And it can have an impact. In Scotland, for example, human rights treaty body recommendations have gained traction. So in the last 12 months, the Minister for Childcare and Early Years in Scotland has now announced a bill will be introduced to increase the minimum age of criminal responsibility to 12 years of age in line with international human rights standards. In addition, the private members' bill of the Green MSP Mike Finney to remove the defence of justifiable assault that allows the physical punishment of children is now to be supported by the Scottish Government. And you can introduce those kinds of issues in a holistic way that looks at kind of parental and other issues and how you can manage them without physical punishment of children in a very positive way. It's been done in another number of other European countries. Finally, this year has also seen the transition from one set of human rights commissioners to a completely new group. And I want to pay tribute to the outgoing commissioners and also the Chief Executive, Virginia McVeigh, who has moved to pastures anew. I don't think Virginia anticipated 2 elections in the first 3 months of her tenure when she moved. I have to say that the previous commission were resolutely independent and pluralist in the best traditions of the UN Paris Principles for a National Human Rights Institution. We robustly debated issues. Sometimes they were difficult discussions, but always maintained a very effective personal and working relationships despite the different views around the table. And that group of commissioners have left a very positive and, in my view, a lasting legacy for a new set of commissioners to build on. And I want to welcome the new commissioners here, many of whom are here today. And then in conclusion, I am struck looking around this room and who's come today at the breadth and the depth of experience and knowledge that's here. I can see people who have stood tall in very difficult and dark times with great resilience. I can also see a smattering of younger people. It's perhaps all relative to your own age, but there are many people who I can see here who have still to make their mark, and I know they undoubtedly will do so. And it's people like you and others in Northern Ireland who have a role to play in terms of promoting and protecting human rights alongside the Commission. And it's one of the privileges of my job is you get to meet many remarkable people in this room and beyond. And it's that restores my glass half full outlook on life. So I commend the report to you, and I'd like to thank you for coming today. Thank you. I'm going to pass you straight over to Harriet then to deliver her speech, and we will then have a Q&A afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I always think that the vibrancy of the city of Belfast and the absolute beauty of the stunning countryside, which is so close at hand, is just one of our best kept secrets. So it's a real pleasure to be with you all here today, and I've had a very warm welcome to another speaker, and thanks to Les for inviting me, and also for your input, the input of your commission to the Joint Committee on Human Rights. And I think that was very important in the past year, and look forward to working with you in the future. And I'm very glad to play my part in helping you launch this annual statement. And I congratulate all of you who were involved, staff of the Commission, commissioners, and all of you in the other organisations who play a role in the work that is testified to here, and the pointers that it looks ahead to for the future. I do remember when the Commission was established in 1999 as part of the peace process, but there's been a movement for human rights and equality in Northern Ireland, of course, long before that, and always strong links with the human rights movement in the rest of the UK. In the 1970s, when I was a legal officer at the National Council for Civil Liberty, now Liberty, there was an active Northern Ireland committee examining and challenging everything to do with human rights, from job discrimination to internment without trial. Because of the divisions between the Catholic and the Protestant community and the accompanying violence and intimidation, the context for your promotion of human rights was highly challenging, but also hugely important. You have had to defend rights in a very difficult context of and amidst controversy caused by issues that we haven't had to deal with, such as those surrounding parades, protests, and blasphemy. So I start by acknowledging the brave work on human rights and equality that has been done within and between Northern Ireland's different communities. Your commission has, over the years, dealt with all the issues that the EOC, the CRE, as it was, and now the Equality and Human Rights Commission does, of sex discrimination and racism. And you have, like other commissions, moved forward on issues which are newly commanding focus on the rights agenda, such as age discrimination, disability discrimination, gay rights, female genital mutilation, and human trafficking. I've admired in particular the work over the years of the women's movement in Northern Ireland. And as we campaigned for laws prohibiting sex discrimination and unequal pay, and for those laws to be rigorously implemented, I knew of and admired the work of people such as Inez McCormack, who, along with many others, blazed a trail for women in Northern Ireland. And although the context of the campaign for women's equality in Northern Ireland was very different from our situation, many of the battles were the same. And the women's movement had the same energising effect on all of us. And I can see some of you in the room who are part of that generation. All over England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and our arguments were the same. We wanted nothing less than the transformation of women's role in the home, at work, and in society. So when I was growing up in the 1960s and 70s, the summit of aspiration for a girl was to get a husband. And when you'd achieved that lofty ambition, your aspiration was to look after him, the home, and the children. Education was regarded as wasted on a girl, or worse, was dangerous, because it might jeopardize her ability to snare that husband. Because no man would want a wife who was too clever by half, and certainly not one who was cleverer than him. Women worked but didn't have careers. Women who'd gone out to work when they left school, and there was that phrase, giving up to get married. And I met a woman when I was in Scotland a month or so ago who was in her early 80s. And she told me that after she'd left school at 16, she did her banking exams and she went to work in the finance sector in Edinburgh. But she gave up to get married when she was 24. And her husband then died when she was 50. So she went back into the bank. But unfortunately, she was made redundant at 54. So you could see how her working life experience was very, very much curtailed by marriage. But for the unfortunate few who'd failed to achieve this ambition of the husband, and there was a whole language around these women, spinsters, left on the shelf, wallflowers. Some of those did have careers. But then, of course, there was the cautionary tale of the unmarried mother, because she would have neither the husband nor the career. So my own mother, one of the very few who went to university, qualified as a barrister, but she gave up the law when she got married. Solicitors, who obviously brief barristers, explained to her that clients thought they were getting second best and would lose their case if they had a woman barrister. And anyway, she had a more pressing role, which was to make my father's dinner. So she gave up the law, and her wig and gown was consigned to our dressing up box. I didn't really think much of it then, but now I feel it's very poignant. And indeed, dedicated herself to making his breakfast and his dinner. And I remember one occasion where he'd retired. She had decided to go back into the law, but to train as being a solicitor. And he'd retired and was sitting at the table reading the newspaper. She was cooking his breakfast, which was kippers, so there was quite a smell emanating from that. But because she was going to be at the College of Law during the day, she was also cooking his supper, because it would need to be back on the table on time. And that was curry, so there was an awful smell of the curry and the kippers. But at the back of the cooker, her law book was propped up. And I remember thinking, that is not for me. That is not how I'm going to live my life. And I was part of a new generation of women who weren't going to lead our lives like that. We weren't going to put up with it. We weren't going to have the man as head of the household. I mean, that wasn't just a slogan. That was the reality. His word went. We weren't going to do what our mothers had done, which is take a vow to obey our husband. We wanted to be equal partners. We didn't agree that actually he had a right to beat her. And in fact, if he did beat her, it was probably her fault. She'd probably brought it on herself. And actually, it was his job to keep her in order. We didn't agree with that. We didn't agree that you had to be defined by what you looked like, or that you would have to choose between a family and work. We thought that you should be able to do both. And to do that, we needed to break into men-only areas in every walk of life. We didn't want there to be a men-only judiciary, which there was. It's very gratifying, the progress that's made in that respect here in Northern Ireland. We didn't want there to be a men-only leadership of the trade union movement, bit slower progress on that. And men at the top of business, men making all the decisions in councils, in parliament and in governments. So this was a very big agenda of the women's movement. We demanded an equal say as a matter of principle, because to exclude women was discrimination, but also because we felt it would lead to better decisions. This was really challenging the established order and was fiercely resisted. Even just counting the numbers was controversial. I did a survey to do a report called The Democratic Deficit, which was the first survey of the percentage of women councillors. And bearing in mind that women were most of the employees of councils and women were great users of council services, it seemed not much to be asking councils what percentage of councillors were women. And for those that didn't reply to our survey, which is a great many, my office rang them up and got an earful of abuse and said it was a personal matter and why were we asking, and a lot of anger was generated. And we had the same when I did the survey of women on boards in private companies. I called it the FTSE Female Index. We looked through all the company reports to see who was on the board and to then see how many in the top 100, which was the majority, had men-only boards. But there were some where they were called Hillary or Joe or Lindsay, and we couldn't be absolutely sure whether they were men or women. And so we rang up and got absolutely torrents of abuse as to why we were asking what the gender was of people on the board. And in fact, the FTSE, bless them, rang up and said that they would sue us if we called it the FTSE Female Index. So actually, even asking the question about who was making decisions and whether there were any women in the room was regarded as absolutely outrageous. And of course, there were very few women in Parliament. I got selected and elected in 1982, but because of the very poor results for Labour in the election, the general election of 1983, no other young members of the women's movement, we'd all planned to go in together and be the sisterhood there in the House of Commons. They didn't get elected. And we continue to press for more women in Parliament because it's hard to make a difference if you're outnumbered. You really need a critical mass. Numbers do count. So when I was first elected in 1982, it was to a House of Commons of 97% men and only 3% women. And MPs from Northern Ireland constituencies were 100% men. There was no women's voices from Northern Ireland in Westminster. Women's voices were simply not heard. And we thought it was not enough to get the vote so that we could vote for men to make the decisions. We wanted to have our own voice. And that was part of Labour women's struggle for women's representation, which we thought was embarrassingly low in what was the Party for Women and Equality. So this movement in the Labour Party was in all regions, women from trade unions, women from professional backgrounds. We made the case. Come on, guys, you know, we're the Party of Women's Equality. Isn't it a bit embarrassing that the Party of Women's Equality just looks like it's all men? But that made no difference. Some of them agreed with us, and it made no difference, and others really criticised us and said we were criticising them and took it personally, but nothing changed. Then we argued to have, and we got a constitutional change, that we would have a woman on every shortlist. And that was created a massive backlash, but we got it through. And of course, it made no difference at all because the men on the shortlist got selected. So we had the woman there on the shortlist, but no change. So then we thought, well, we better have half and half, 50% shortlist for seats where Labour was expecting to win. We're going to insist on half. More rows, conference decision, 50% on shortlists, men up in arms. And it made no difference at all. that 50% of the shortlist that was men carried on getting selected. So that's when we went for all women shortlists. And that's how we arrived at a process which was positive action, big time, which basically said the local party can choose whoever it wants to be the Labour candidate for this constituency, but they just can't choose a man. And we only did that because we tried everything else and we hadn't succeeded. And of course, it worked. I mean, there was a lot of fury about it, real bitterness. I remember one man who'd been hoping to be an MP bitterly saying to me that I'd ruined his life. And he said, I've moved my wife and my children to this dump of a godforsaken constituency, and now the MP's starting to look really unwell and I'm hopeful he'll die. And you mean now that I can't even apply for it. So there was a lot of personal bitterness around that. However, it led to, in 1997, 100 women Labour MPs, and having been 3%, suddenly we were a critical mass. And that changed everything. It changed not the way just Parliament looked, but it changed the political agenda. Women had got into Parliament, but they were still we were still very much the junior partners, the newest. But over time, obviously, women gained experience, they gained the seniority, women started moving into the civil service, women started becoming special advisors and into the political commentariat, which had hitherto been entirely male. And as more women were elected on all sides of the House of Commons, the momentum gathered for what turned into be a steady march of progress. We had a national childcare strategy. We doubled maternity pay and leave and introduced paternity leave for the first time. We had new laws on domestic violence. And in the 30 years since I became an MP, what we have now is a transformed political agenda, but the practical reality is that we still need much more to change. So there is an acknowledgement now that domestic violence is a terrible thing, that it's never justified, that it always harms children. But it's still pervasive. Still 2 women a week are killed by a current or former husband or partner, and still domestic violence refuges turn women away every day. There's an acknowledgement because of the under-resourcing. There's an acknowledgement that women are entitled to equal pay, but they still don't get it. Once they've had their first child, let alone their second, their pay and prospects suffer and never recover. We're moving on now to requiring companies and organisations to publish their pay gap within each organisation. And I think that that's something that definitely needs to be extended to Northern Ireland. There's an acknowledgement that women need time off when they have a baby. But maternity pay is so low that still most women can't afford to take all their maternity leave, and there is a woefully small take-up of paternity leave because most families just can't afford it. And as yet, there is absolutely no maternity or paternity leave for MPs or councillors. We're hoping to change that in the House of Commons. It is about 30 years too late for me, but I'm still working on it, and I've got we have very active support from Sylvia Herman and Emma Little-Pengelly on that. There's a recognition that childcare is essential, but there are still women tearing their hair out trying to find or trying to afford good quality, flexible childcare, or instead they can't find it and are unable to work. So in the decades ahead, we must, having won the arguments, we must win the practical change. Next year, as we celebrate the centenary of the first women winning the right to vote, we must step up our ambition, not just to get into the room, but to insist on change. Less persuasion and more insistence. Less requests, more demands. Less suggesting, more asserting. Now, one of the most fundamental tenets of the women's movement has always been solidarity between women. And back in the 1970s, the notion of sisterhood was new and a very surprising thing. When I was growing up, other women were supposed to regard each other as deadly rivals, mostly in competition to get the husband. There was plentiful language to describe women's rivalry with each other, such as scratching each other's eyes out. I remember once my sister was applying for work as a lawyer in the 1970s. This was before the Sex Discrimination Act banned overt discrimination against women in job ads. So she applied to a firm where she knew they already had a woman. Phoning them and saying she'd like to apply, they said, no, you can't apply. And she said, why? And they said, because you're a woman. She said, but you've already got a woman. They said, yeah, if we had another, you'd only fight. And that was the sense that women would not be supportive of each other. But the determination that we could stand together in solidarity, working together in common cause, was one of the most transformative elements of the women's movement. The women's movement changed how we saw ourselves, how we saw our relationships with men, and how we related to each other. We were going to insist on pressing forward in every aspect of life, in factories, in offices, in the law, in universities, in councils and in parliament, and in our own home. That's still work in progress. And the way we were going to do this was by working together as women. Women not as rivals, but as allies in the difficult and often painful quest for change. And that solidarity was between all women, not just those near at hand, but those from other walks of life, women in different countries, and from other parts of the country. So we looked over to our sisters in Northern Ireland, and they looked over to us. So many things about our lives were different, but so much of our ambition was the same. And instinctively, we were and are in solidarity with women's quest for change here. Relations between the government in Westminster and decision-making in Northern Ireland was and remains extraordinarily sensitive and complex, deeply entwined with the peace process, which we all wanted to see succeed. Often, when women in Northern Ireland reached out to us for our support, we were warned by colleagues in Parliament, that's got to be decided in Northern Ireland. If you interfere, you'll jeopardise the peace settlement. Of course, it's fundamental to us that we support devolution and decision-making by Northern Ireland's own representatives. But there's a new dimension to the sense of solidarity between women in Westminster with our sisters in Northern Ireland, which I think marks a real turning point. The preparedness of Parliament to engage in the issue of abortion for Northern Irish women is a testament to that. In a parliamentary Labour Party which is now 43% women, and where there are young women on all sides of the House who are what I describe as daughters of the women's movement, there is now a refusal to accept being told to stay out of it. Just accept what male-dominated Northern Irish politics dictates and don't intrude. And another tenet of the women's movement was that we should decide for ourselves as women and that men should not tell us what to do. The slogan on the banners that we marched under in the 1960s in support of the Abortion Act was not the church, not the state, women must decide their fate. We could have added, if it rhymed, when it comes to women's lives, women, not men, should decide. In those days, there was a natural expectation that men made decisions and women abided by them. In the early 1980s, as a new MP, this is another survey I did a survey of the expert committees which advised government. It was men in government being advised by male advisory committees. Men, it seemed, were the experts on everything: the mines, the motorways, the money supply. But it was the last straw for me when I discovered that even on the Maternity Services Advisory Committee, it was all men. But it seems they were expert on giving birth to and had the say-so on abortion. When I look back at the progress we made, I can see that there are some lessons that I've learnt. One of them is that you're always told that there is an overriding reason that you shouldn't interfere in support of other women. There's always a political imperative advanced That though it might be right in principle, it's not right at this particular point to act in support of that particular quest for equality. Heeding those voices is applauded as realistic and as teamly. But the reality is that that lack of solidarity weakens equality movements and postpones the day when people achieve the rights that they seek. So we were warned that putting gay marriage in the Equality Act would anger the Catholic Church in Scotland and thereby unsettle the Labour vote there, and therefore we mustn't go ahead with that. We were warned that using our votes to support the demand of women in Northern Ireland for abortion would destabilise the finely balanced, all-important political equilibrium within Northern Ireland and between Britain and Northern Ireland, and jeopardise the peace process, so we mustn't get involved. We've always deferred on questions of devolution. That was the reason we didn't, for example, extend the Equality Act to Northern Ireland. But the question we're asking now is, where does that leave you? If it leaves you failing to extend equality to gay couples, how can that be right? If it leaves women in Northern Ireland without our support for abortion rights, rights that we in the rest of the UK have had since 1967, how can that be right? If it leaves women in Northern Ireland held back by male-dominated politics, how can that be right? And there is a new sense amongst women in Westminster that we will not step aside when our sisters in Northern Ireland call for our support in the future. I don't know whether that's because there are more women MPs on all sides of the House of Commons, and that brings with it a new assertiveness, or whether it's because the new generation of women are that much more distant from the violence of the worst divisions in Northern Ireland. But whatever the reason, I think it promises significant and welcome change. And the manifestation of this came with, as Les mentioned, the change on abortion in England for Northern Irish women. The government had to accede to the demands which were ably spearheaded by Stella Creasy MP for women from Northern Ireland to get NHS abortions in England without having to pay. They had to accede to those demands because if they didn't, we would vote on it, and if we had the numbers and they would lose. So you didn't see the vote happening, but that's what actually happened. The numbers were there to vote on an issue which hitherto would never have been regarded as right to be voted on in Westminster. Those who oppose change can, in my view, no longer rely on the assumption that Westminster will step back from supporting demands for rights in Northern Ireland because of our support for devolution. Women's rights, gay rights, they're human rights. Human rights are universal, and we must champion them in every part of the UK as well, and Northern Ireland, as well as every part of the world. We will call on your solidarity as we struggle to take things forward. And I can say with confidence that you can call on our support. So let's work together closely. And I'm sure that we can identify opportunities to turn that solidarity into action. Thank you.
We now have time to take questions from the floor, and if it's okay, I'm going to take 2 or 3 in a go, and then Les and Harriet are going to field them as appropriate.
Harriet, thanks for that. My name is Niall Bakewell. Just talking about the need to champion human rights and stand up for it. Do you now regret the summer 2015 when you failed to lead on championing human rights of the poor, when you failed to lead an opposition vote to Tory austerity at that time? Because no greater assault on the poor has happened, I think, in recent times than what we've had over the last 7 years. Your opportunity then was to show leadership, was to make a statement against an assault on the human rights of the poor, and instead you chose to lead a Labour abstention on that.
So what happened with the Welfare Reform and Work Act was what the government did is they put in some benefit changes which we bitterly opposed, but they also put in measures for 3 million apprenticeships, which we supported. And what you do if you've got a bill where some things in it you detest, but other things you strongly support, you do what's called a reasoned amendment, whereby you table an amendment and say, we decline to give this bill a second reading because, and then you say, because we don't agree with the welfare changes. So we did oppose those cuts in tax credits. We did oppose those changes in benefits. Remember, those were the tax credits that we had put in, which were one of the very important things that the Labour government did to tackle child poverty. And obviously, I was part of that Labour government. So it's not a proper description to say that when I was acting leader in 2015, that I didn't oppose those benefit changes. But we did support the apprenticeships programme, which is why instead of voting outright against the bill as a whole, we declined to give it its second reading, as it's called, and said that's why we declined to give it a second reading. Thank you for that question.
Hello, my name is Yvonne Galligan from Queen's University Centre for the Advancement of Women in Politics. First of all, thank you very much for your speech, which I think gave many of us great heart and brought back many of the memories of the women's movement and all of those activities. I would suggest that we now have to make another big step forward, big leap forward in the area of women's representation. Because even though there is a critical mass here in Northern Ireland, in the Northern Ireland Assembly, when it is up and running again, and in Westminster, it's still not enough. A critical mass of 30% is not enough. We are 50% of the population, 50% of voters, and we should have 50% of seats in all assemblies and in all decision-making arenas. So my question is to you, what can be done in Westminster to enable that 50% representation take place very soon? Let's not have to wait another generation for it to happen. Thank you.
Well, I very much agree with what you say, Yvonne, that actually we shouldn't be grateful for where we're at. We should be gratified at the progress we've made, but recognise that we've still got more progress to make. And, you know, being outnumbered 4-1 in the House of Commons is better than being 3%, but it is not equality. And interestingly, the reason why a lot of MPs are more junior women MPs than the male MPs is because women MPs last less long than men, and that is not because we are faint-hearted or can't, you know, stand the pace. It's because women tend to come into the House of Commons later after they've had their children, and they tend to be in the most marginal seats, the ones that then risk losing their seat next time round, so that there's a bigger turnover of women, and therefore women remain more junior in that situation. So I think that we have to step up the pace, and I think that the centenary of women's right to vote, which is happening next year, is an opportunity for us to focus right back on that. It's not just about voting, but it's about taking those decisions. I think that we've got to have within our own party, within the Labour Party, an absolute commitment. We won't be having a leadership election anytime soon, but when we do have a leadership election, we must actually have a woman leader. It's not acceptable that the Tories have managed to have, two women leaders, and there have been women leaders of other parties, but Labour, the party of women and equality, which pioneered women's representation in the House of Commons, we have only managed to choose men as our leaders. So one of the things that I'm doing with this is when I see a very, very able man in the House of Commons, in the Labour Party, doing really, really well, of which there are many, I say to them, what a great job you're doing. That is fantastic. You can really, really go far in the Labour Party. You could even be deputy leader. And that gives them a bit of a shock. But I really mean it. And Saida Varsi, who I believe is in the wrong party since she's in the Conservative Party, and she is really all-round a very excellent person, she said that it takes a very exceptional man to be a leader, but it takes an even more exceptional man to support a woman leader. And I think that we should cultivate amongst men that sense that actually what they need to focus their exceptionality on is not being a leader themselves and pushing women out the way, but actually supporting the women leader. And we have many excellent women in the Labour Party who would make perfectly good, in fact, better than perfectly good leaders. But once we start choosing from amongst men and women, as sure as eggs is eggs, we will end up with another man leader, and we can't do that. And my other concern is about decision making, is that there are still too many important decisions which are taken in men-only rooms. You know, rooms of advisors, rooms of researchers. And I don't think that it's acceptable in this day and age for decisions to be made, even if they're behind the scenes decisions, many of them are very important decisions, in men-only rooms. So we must kind of delegitimize the idea that a meeting of what even an informal one of men only is quorate. You know, we must have the notion of a gender quorum, that there must be women there to make that meeting effective. So we still have a way to go. And again, it's about women's rights. It's about our right to be part of that decision making, but it also makes for better decision making, because as the speaker said, the more heterogeneous your decision-making body is, the more you have a 360-degree view, and male-dominated decisions are not as good as decisions made by a balanced group of women and men. So we need to improve the quality of decision-making by making sure that men don't get to do it on their own.
Hello, Kelly Andrews, Belfast and Lisburn Women's Aid. I really enjoyed your speech here today, and I want to ask, the Department of Justice has been working on a number of protective initiatives, the Domestic Violence Disclosure Scheme and the Domestic Violence Homicide Review. Unfortunately, we've no assembly to pass the legislation. I was just wondering, could you share some of the experience of the legislation in England?
We did have major legislation during the time that we were in government, including instituting homicide reviews, including something actually which we borrowed from Northern Ireland, which was that breach of an injunction was a criminal offence. We had two separate, tracks. One was the civil court, one the criminal court. And if an injunction was breached, it wasn't a criminal offence. So we put that in as well, and many other issues. And the government is actually having a domestic abuse bill in the forthcoming session. Most of the legislation in Westminster has been junked on account of the government's capacity is completely taken up with Brexit, but also because they don't have a majority, they're frightened to put anything through where they'd have to use some of their political capacity to try and get the votes through when they want to use all that political capacity to persuade people to vote on Brexit. But the one bill they are saying that they will have is a domestic abuse bill. And one of the things that we are talking about, and Vera Baird, who used to be an MP and used to be Solicitor General and is now Police Commissioner in Northumberland, we're drafting an amendment and a new clause to go in the bill. The bill hasn't appeared yet, but we're drafting our new clause already, which basically would specify a percentage of GNI, gross national income, which would go for refugees. Because refugees are, by definition, often can't be local. I mean, they might be in a local place, but the women who need them need to often go out of their area, which is a terrible thing, but that is the case, and therefore there needs to be national funding. And in this day and age, the idea that everybody agrees that refugees are an important thing, and yet they live hand to mouth and are facing cuts at the moment, that we're putting into the bill a clause which will, like we have 0.7% of GNI is for international development. We're going to put into that bill 0.007%, which is the calculation by the refuge movement of how much they need to provide the refugees, and that we would put that in legislation, same as we've got it in legislation for international development, a percentage of GNI. But also, if the long title, as it's called, is wide enough, i.e. if the scope of the bill allows us to do that, it might be an opportunity for extending some of the domestic violence legislation that we've got in England and Wales. It might be an opportunity to extend that to Northern Ireland. So therefore we will put in amendments on that, those that you want, and you can tell us what amendments you'd like us to put forward, and we will put them forward, unless the government procedurally tries to block that. It's a bit difficult, because when I say we're going to do that, you can tell they're immediately working away on what the procedures are to block that, because they don't want to see themselves as blocking those rights, but they certainly don't want to allow it to happen. So we have got opportunities to work together with this domestic abuse bill to make progress for not only for us in the UK, but also for you here in Northern Ireland. In England and Wales.
Thank you. Joan Smith, ex-head of the Equal Opportunities Commission and a member of the Women's National Commission in the past. I'd like to thank you very much, and indeed your praise to the champions of rights that are in this room, and I'm conscious that I see many of them colleagues and friends from many years ago, and currently still with the huge enthusiasm to still keep rights to the top of the agenda. Could I just ask you whether you think, in the context of Brexit, whether our human rights, and particularly sex equality rights, will be diminished in any way, given that in the past we have used Article 119 of the Treaty of Rome to take cases where we were unsuccessful in both Northern Ireland and in the UK courts, but were successfully able to go to Europe. And I worry that Brexit is not going to protect that right and allow us to do that.
Well, as Les mentioned, the government is being very ambiguous about this and not answering straight questions. We wrote to them from the Joint Committee on Human Rights asking those very questions, and they are again not answered in the document that the government has just produced. The point is that if you look at the evolution of rights that we have now, whether it's rights in relation to part-time workers, whether it's rights for women, equal pay for work of equal value, not just the same or similar work, what has happened, and it is paradoxical that the Brussels establishment has been a friend to women's and human rights in this country. That is just simply a fact of the matter. Some of our progress has been made through Westminster, but it has also been augmented by the progress that's been made across Europe. And my worry is that I don't want to see us get frozen in time. So the government could say, we're going to guarantee all the rights that there currently are. But that's not good enough, because I don't want to see us become like the poor relations. As rights move ahead, for example, on parental leave and on disability discrimination, and that there's an evolving pattern of rights, and that we get sort of like fossilized here where we are now. We don't want people, at work or generally in society to be the poor relations whilst rights remain stronger and move forward in Europe. And they could agree an amendment to the Brexit bill which says not only will we in our own parliament enforce all the rights that we've got there, but that we will keep pace with the rights that are developing in Europe, so that we could have an amendment to match the progress. And Dominic Grieve, a former Attorney General, has tabled amendments along those lines, which I'm also supporting. So we could do something about that, but the problem is that the government will oppose them all. And because the government is not got a majority, and because it's worried about the lack of support in public opinion for the government after the shock of the 2017 election result. They are very nervous about voting against the government. So what you see at the moment is a lot of people, good people often, doing fire and brimstone against the government on rights. But when it comes to the votes, they don't actually vote for it. So like, for example, from the Joint Committee on Human Rights, I moved an amendment to give EU citizens the rights that they've got, but to give it in law. And a lot of people spoke very movingly on other sides of the House and said how much they support this. But when it came to the vote, they didn't vote for it. So, you know, that is the disappointing context for that. And it's really no good making speeches if you're not prepared to actually back it up with votes. So, but I think they're worried that if the government loses a vote, it will all fall apart. I mean, I say to them, it's falling apart anyway, so you don't need to worry about that. What difference will voting for something which you believe in make when it's a shambles anyway? But they haven't quite got to that state of grace yet.
I think we have time just for 2 more questions. Urgent, maybe last one I can squeeze in.
Thanks. Patrick Corrigan, Northern Ireland Programme Director of Amnesty International. First of all, thank you so much for coming and for delivering that really hopeful speech about the distance travelled and some of the directions still to go, the road to go down. You said that sort of you and others in Parliament stood ready to help advance rights for gay people here, for women's rights. And those are all issues that Amnesty is working on. So I wonder, could you talk about how maybe in 2018, particularly, you know, we now have this place, this institution not functioning for almost a year now, how do you think that significant backbench support across the parties in Westminster can be translated into real change for human rights for people living in Northern Ireland?
Well, I think that what the work that Stella Creasy did demonstrated is that when you can get the numbers, then the government will back down. But it's just not been done before because of the deference to devolution. And therefore, I think it is really a new situation. So if there's any bit of legislation where there is an opportunity for an amendment to come forward, then you will find that there are those who will be prepared to indicate to the government that they are in support, and then the government will have to back down. So I think really it requires from all of us a new way of thinking about this. In a way, there's been a kind of expectation that you don't ask for us to amend primary legislation in ways which would affect you, because we won't do it, because we will be deferring to devolution. But I think that has really changed. Really, it is quite marked that it's changed, and it's changed sort of quite suddenly with the new intake of 2017, not only on our side, but also on other sides as well. People for whom be careful, because the whole of, you know, we might be back to, you know, the early 1990s. It all seems so long ago for them. They just don't sort of clock onto the argument. So they just think, well, if this is being called for and this is what we want and we've got the opportunity, we'll get on ahead and do it. So I think it does require us to work together in ways that we haven't done before, and to take whatever, you know, the opportunities that will be there. So any bit of legislation that comes forward in the Westminster Parliament, obviously we can't propose legislation because we're in opposition, but any bit of legislation that comes forward which could be amended, I think you will find that there is a ready group of people who will amend it. And then, you know, the government might think twice and think, well, actually it's a good idea, we might as well not have a row about it, let's just do it. And they are quite in row avoidance mode, because all their effort is used with rowing amongst themselves. So therefore they don't necessarily want to start breakout rows all over the place. I mean, really, quite seriously, that is what's happening. It is very unprecedented, but let's use that for making some progress, if we can.
We'll be in touch.
Yeah.
Hi, Harriet. My name is Brian Payne. I'm a journalist. I'm also the editor of a social affairs magazine called View. But 3 years ago, we done a magazine. We do themed issues, and we looked at homelessness. And in recent, I was in touch with a homeless organisation in Belfast and asked them, was it better? Was it worse? You know, what was the situation regarding it? And it was much worse. So we went back and done another issue on it. So, and the situation in homelessness in Northern Ireland, which is it's a problem right across the UK, but for a lot of historical reasons, low pay, etc. It's really very specific issue in Northern Ireland. And just recently, our Belfast City Council, in their wisdom, I can't get anybody to talk about it, they decided to go into a small little park in Belfast and remove these 10 benches, which were used for homeless people during the daytime who slept on these benches. There was also allegations of antisocial behaviour. I don't know, maybe there was. But it seemed to me the wrong way to go about dealing with the problem was to remove. I visited the site last week, and it looked like an act of vandalism. They left the stumps and took away the benches. The question I'm asking, and after doing 2 issues, I think the problem is not that complicated. We need a massive programme of social housing. What are your views on it, Harriet?
Well, certainly we do need a massive programme of social housing, and you don't solve the problem of homelessness by removing benches. And what you solve it by is not only social housing, but also investing in organisations that support families that are in conflict, that support people with mental health problems, people who have fallen into drug or alcohol abuse, people who are leaving prison, that supporting and investing in that network, both of statutory agencies, but also the non-statutory agencies, which are the fibre and the fabric which support people when they face difficulties, is that it's when that wears thin that homelessness grows. And I'm afraid it is just always the case. And I have seen, Tory governments, Labour governments, Tory governments, and it is just the case that homelessness grows under Tory governments, and you have to invest to make sure that homelessness is not rising again. And they are doing the opposite of investing, because what they're doing is cutting back on all those organisations, and they will say how much they regret homelessness, but they are actually precipitating it by their policies.
Can I just add? Can I just add one thing to that very quickly, which is, if you look in your report, one of the most shocking statistics in this report is that the average life expectancy of a homeless woman is 43 years of age. A homeless man is 48 years of age. So women and men will live 30 years less than those who have stable housing options. And ISESCA's concluding observations less than 18 months ago was that you should not criminalise those who are sleeping rough, and that you should look to reintegrate homeless people back into the community as effectively as you can. And it seems to me the Belfast City Council's approach to this goes in exactly the wrong direction compared to what ISESCA's concluding observation had to say.
I think that's us completed, so if you want to just continue that.
Oh, grand. Sorry. Look, can I thank everyone for coming today? I'd like to thank both the outgoing and incoming commissioners, but also the commission staff who've managed that transition with great aplomb and who have organised today. Frankly, I spend much of my time front of house, but all the hard work goes on behind the scenes, and I'm very grateful for the work that's done by, we have a very small staff. Probably pugilism is not the greatest way to give a metaphor, but we punch way above our weight. I'm sure there's a more pacifist way to say that, but we do, and that's down to the quality of staff we have. Thank you for coming today. I hope you found it useful, and I look forward to seeing many of you again, hopefully in 2018, where you might see some green lights in our annual statement. So thank you very much.